You are listening to Fictional Radio Broadcast, live reports from fictional events. This broadcast is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. What follows is a dramatized scenario.
If you are anywhere west, southwest, or downstream of Mount St. Helens tonight, do not use this morning's news to decide whether you are safe. At 4:11 a.m., the mountain erupted. The event lasted only minutes. Officials later said the initial explosive phase appeared to be over. 27 minutes after the eruption began, instruments beneath Mount St. Helens detected a new earthquake more than 12 kilometers below the crater. Since then, that activity has been moving upward. The mountain has not erupted a second time. Not yet. You are listening to Fictional Radio Broadcast, and the most important thing scientists have learned today is that the first eruption may not have released the pressure beneath Mount St. Helens. It may have removed what was holding the deeper pressure down. My name is Ethan Cole. For listeners accustomed to hearing Daniel Hale on this frequency, Daniel is going to be away from the broadcast desk for the next several days. There is nothing alarming behind that. He is simply off the schedule for a short period. I joined the station this week, and this was supposed to be one of my first orientation shifts. At 3:58 this morning, I was in the back office, going through transmitter procedures, when the first volcanic activity bulletin crossed the wire. By 4:20, I had been moved to the live desk. I have been here since. So, for anyone hearing my voice for the first time tonight, I want to establish something. I will separate confirmed information from preliminary information. I will tell you when a report comes from an official monitoring station. I will tell you when it comes from a listener. I will tell you when scientists disagree, and when we do not know something, I am not going to fill the silence with speculation. Tonight there is quite a lot we do not know, but there are several things we know with increasing confidence. Mount St. Helens erupted at 4:11 this morning. The eruption was relatively small. The visible activity decreased rapidly. For several hours, it appeared that the worst part of the event might already have happened. That assumption is no longer considered safe. We are going to reconstruct the day from the beginning, because the sequence matters, and the part that matters most happened after the mountain became quiet. At 3:14 this morning, the first unusual seismic signal appeared beneath Mount St. Helens. It lasted approximately 11 seconds. Low frequency, low amplitude. Nothing about it justified public alarm. Mount St. Helens is an active volcano. Active volcanoes produce earthquakes. Hydrothermal systems move. Rock fractures. Water circulates through heated cracks. Small events happen. At 3:27, another signal appeared. 14 seconds, similar depth, similar frequency. At 3:31, another. At 3:34, another. At 3:39, another. By 3:41, the monitoring software had grouped them into a swarm. An on-call seismologist logged into the network. The initial question was not whether Mount St. Helens was about to erupt. The initial question was whether the instruments were recording the mountain at all. Wind can contaminate seismic data. Roadwork can create vibration. Equipment can drift. Ice can move around an installation. A sensor can fail. Those possibilities were checked. The signals were volcanic. At 3:52, a thermal instrument aimed toward the crater showed a small increase across an area near the existing dome. At 3:55, one shallow seismic station began detecting weak, continuous tremor. At 3:58, a preliminary advisory was issued. The language was cautious. A small cluster of volcanic earthquakes was underway. The activity was consistent with fluid movement at shallow depth. Monitoring had been increased. No major eruptive event was being forecast. 13 minutes later, at 4:11 a.m., Mount St. Helens erupted. The first thing several witnesses described was not the ash, it was the sound. A road crew, working well outside the restricted area, reported one heavy detonation. A ranger station farther west reported a low rolling sound that lasted after the initial blast. A thermal camera showed material moving vertically through the crater. A dark plume rose rapidly. For a few minutes, lightning flickered inside the ash. The column climbed above the summit, then it stopped growing. There was no large flank collapse, no major lateral blast. No large pyroclastic flow was observed leaving the crater. No destructive lahar developed in the river systems. The eruption lasted less than 6 minutes at its strongest phase. By 4:20, the plume was thinning. By 4:23, seismic amplitude had fallen sharply. By 4:29, cameras showed mostly steam and residual ash. At 4:31, officials issued an update stating that the initial explosive phase appeared to have concluded. That sentence would become one of the most replayed sentences of the day. Initial explosive phase appears to have concluded. At the time, the available surface evidence supported it. The plume was collapsing. Seismic activity near the crater had fallen. The ground immediately around the upper system appeared to be relaxing. Nothing visible suggested a second major event. At 4:36, one member of the monitoring staff reportedly used the phrase, "convincing decline." At 4:38, the entire interpretation changed. Not because Mount St. Helens erupted again. It did not. At 4:38, an earthquake occurred deep beneath the mountain. The initial automated location placed it somewhere below 11 kilometers. The magnitude was approximately 3. Again, not extraordinary by itself, but the waveform was different from most of the shallow activity that had preceded the eruption. And within minutes, another deep signal appeared, then another. The first eruption was ending at the surface. Something underneath it had started. There is a reason I keep giving you exact times. 4:11, 4:38, 27 minutes. That interval is at the center of the scientific discussion tonight. If the 4:38 event had occurred before the eruption, the sequence would have been easier to understand. Deep earthquake, magma movement, shallow activity, eruption. That would at least resemble a conventional progression. Instead, the order was reversed. The first eruption happened. The upper system appeared to depressurize. Then deeper activity increased. At 4:44, analysts identified a second long-period event. At 4:51 a third. At 5:03, a GPS receiver on the southern flank transmitted a position correction large enough to trigger automatic review, 2.7 centimeters. Technicians initially suspected an equipment problem. The receiver was checked against another station. That one had moved as well. Not by exactly the same amount, not in exactly the same direction, but enough to make coincidence less likely. At 5:17, a third station showed displacement. At 5:28, scientists began comparing those movements with tilt meter readings near the crater. The result was uncomfortable. The shallowest part of the system appeared to be deflating. That was expected. The first eruption had released gas, ash, steam, and pressure, but a deeper region appeared to be inflating. For listeners without a geological background, inflation means the ground is responding to increasing pressure beneath it. That does not automatically mean magma. Water can move, gas can move, hydrothermal pressure can change, rock can shift. But the depth of the earthquake sequence made simple surface explanations increasingly difficult. At 5:42, authorities closed several roads approaching the highest risk areas. At 5:55, a helicopter assessment planned for first light was postponed because of cloud. At 6:03, the seismic count passed 20 identifiable events. At 6:20, the count passed 30. Not 30 emergencies, not 30 eruptions, 30 data points. 30 pieces of the same developing puzzle. At 6:31, a gas monitoring team began preparing an airborne sampling mission. At 6:47, news broadcasts began using the past tense. Mount St. Helens erupted early this morning. The eruption was brief. Ashfall was limited. Officials were monitoring the situation. That is how the story looked from outside. I saw one of the television feeds when I came into the main studio. The mountain was visible through broken cloud. There was no towering plume, no dramatic glow, no wall of ash. Just a damaged crater giving off steam. It looked finished. I thought it looked finished. I should say that. There is no value in pretending the pattern was obvious in hindsight. It was not. This is probably a good place to explain why you are hearing me instead of Daniel. I joined the station recently. I spent most of yesterday learning procedures that have absolutely nothing to do with volcanoes. Emergency generator transfer, remote transmitter switching, affiliate timing, weather interruption protocol, where the spare headphones are kept, which studio door sticks when the humidity rises. Daniel left a handwritten note beside the primary console. Do not trust the clock above Studio B. It runs 43 seconds slow. He was right. I also found that he keeps the microphone gain 2 marks lower than I do. I changed it. If he is listening, I assume I will be corrected when he returns. There is one other thing on the desk tonight, an old photograph. It belongs to me. My father took it years before I was born. Mount St. Helens before 1980. A near-perfect snow-covered cone. Blue sky, trees in the foreground. No crater, no scar, no plume. He kept that photograph for decades. When I was a kid, he told me something about it that I did not really understand then. He said people remember a disaster by what comes after it. Sometimes you need a picture from before to understand what changed. My father lives outside Woodland now. He is not inside the primary evacuation area, at least not as I am speaking at this stage of the timeline. I called him after the first eruption. He answered. He told me he had already put his emergency bag in the truck. He has lived near enough to the mountain for long enough that he does not need much convincing. Then he told me not to spend my first day on radio sounding nervous, so naturally I have been thinking about that advice for the last 12 hours. At 7:12 this morning, the first gas monitoring flight approached the mountain. Sulfur dioxide was elevated, expected. Carbon dioxide was elevated, also not shocking after an eruption. But the ratios between gases suggested that material from deeper in the system might be contributing. That interpretation was preliminary. At 7:31, additional long-period earthquakes were detected. At 7:48, seismic depth estimates showed some of the events becoming progressively shallower. Not fast, not in a straight line, but the center of activity was moving. At 8:03, the monitoring center changed an internal status phrase. Post-eruptive decline was removed. Ongoing magmatic unrest was inserted. At 8:17, road reopening discussions were suspended. That did not stop people from relaxing. And in fairness, why would it? The mountain was quiet. The ash plume was gone. The morning was beginning. Traffic moved. Coffee shops opened. Parents drove children to school in areas far outside the hazard zone. People photographed the mountain from safe distances. Some residents who had voluntarily left during the eruption turned around and went home. The human mind is very good at recognizing the end of an emergency. Sirens stop, smoke clears, officials lower their voices, roads become ordinary roads again. What we are less good at recognizing is an emergency that becomes more dangerous while looking less dramatic. At 8:44, the first deformation model was completed. At 9:02, technicians repeated it. At 9:20, the model was presented to senior scientists. The uppermost section of the volcano had relaxed. The deeper system had not. The deeper system had expanded, and the expansion had accelerated after 4:11 a.m. That is the first moment today when scientists began asking a question they had not expected to ask. Did the eruption release pressure, or did it change where the pressure was going? At 9:32 this morning, a second public assessment was released. The initial explosive event had ended. Residual volcanic activity remained possible. Monitoring would continue. There was no evidence at that time of a major ongoing surface eruption. Every word was defensible, but people often hear meaning that is not actually present in careful official language. Initial event ended becomes volcano is safe. No major surface eruption becomes nothing else is happening. Monitoring continues becomes scientists are not worried. By 10 o'clock, social media was full of photographs taken from viewpoints west of the mountain. People compared the morning event with 1980. It was smaller. Much smaller. Some news commentary described it as a reminder that Mount St. Helens remains active. That wording made it sound historical almost immediately. A reminder. An interesting morning. A short-lived eruption. At 10:13, one county shelter that had opened as a precaution began discussing reduced staffing. At 10:26, traffic westbound from the mountain began slowing. People were returning. At 10:41, the Geological Service contacted County Emergency Management and asked them not to encourage return travel yet. There was no new evacuation order. The concern was simply that the internal data remained unsettled. At 10:58, a second GPS network solution confirmed continuing deep inflation. At 11:14, one southern tiltmeter changed direction. At 11:27, another began following it. This is where the technical distinction becomes important. Imagine the volcano as several pressure zones rather than one balloon. The first eruption could relieve one part of the system while another part continues to receive material. That does not mean the whole mountain is filling like a tank. Real volcanic plumbing is irregular. Partially molten rock exists within networks. Some pathways open, others close. Gas separates, pressure shifts. What alarmed scientists was not simply that deformation continued, it was that different depths were behaving differently. Shallow deflation, deeper inflation. The first eruption appeared to have changed the pressure balance between them. At 11:42, a geophysicist working the deformation data asked for the morning model to be rerun using only the most reliable instruments. Same result. At 12:03, one potentially noisy station was removed. Same result. At 12:18, satellite radar measurements were incorporated. The shape changed slightly. The conclusion did not. Pressure at depth had increased after the eruption. At 12:46, I received a briefing summary from Dr. Mara Venn. Dr. Venn is a volcanic deformation specialist working with the monitoring team. I want to relay her explanation because it is the clearest version I have heard all day. She described three broad possibilities. The first was measurement error. By noon, that explanation was considered unlikely because independent instruments were agreeing. The second was hydrothermal redistribution. Water beneath volcanoes can move rapidly after an explosive event. Steam systems can produce pressure. Hot fluids can create tremor. The problem was depth. Several important signals were originating far below the shallow hydrothermal zone. The third possibility was fresh magma entering or moving within the deeper system. That possibility was not confirmed, but it fit more of the observations. I asked, through the briefing desk, whether the first eruption could have caused that movement. The answer was carefully phrased. An eruption changes pressure. If material is already close to instability, decompression above it can affect how gases separate from magma. As pressure decreases, dissolved gases can form bubbles that can increase volume, increase buoyancy, increase upward movement. In other words, under the wrong conditions, removing pressure from above a magma body does not necessarily calm it. It can make movement easier. That does not mean every small eruption leads to a larger one. It does not mean a second eruption is inevitable. But it introduces a possibility that did not exist in the morning public narrative. The first eruption might not merely have happened before the current unrest. It might have contributed to it. At 1:08 p.m., authorities stopped using the phrase "conditions are stabilizing." At 1:17, emergency planners were told to keep shelters open. At 1:31, several river valleys were placed under increased monitoring. At 1:49, bridge crews began checking channels likely to carry lahars if another eruption occurred. At 2:02, officials requested additional buses be placed on standby. None of that means a second eruption was predicted. Emergency planning happens before certainty. That is the entire point. But from the public side, the signals were confusing. The mountain looked better. The official response was becoming more serious. At 2:07 p.m., scientists completed the analysis that changed the entire working model. 6 GPS stations, 2 tilt meters, satellite radar, seismic depth estimates, gas measurements. The data were combined. The results showed a pressure source several kilometers below the crater expanding. Not rapidly enough to see with the eye, not dramatically enough to crack roads, but consistently enough that removing individual instruments from the model did not make it disappear. Then researchers compared the deformation with the exact timing of the eruption. Before 4:11, pressure had been concentrated closer to the summit system. At 4:11, the upper section released. Afterward, the deeper section began expanding faster. The critical word was after. The first eruption had not followed the deep inflation. The deep inflation followed the eruption. That did not prove causation. Scientists are careful about that distinction. 2 events can occur in sequence without one causing the other. But the timing forced a new hypothesis onto the table. The eruption may have reduced pressure above a deeper magma body. That pressure reduction may have allowed gas-rich magma to expand. The expansion may have opened or widened fractures leading upward. The 438 earthquake may have marked one of those deeper structural changes. If that interpretation was correct, the eruption at 4:11 was not the end of the pressure cycle. It may have been the beginning of a new one. I asked Dr. Venn for a simpler explanation. The wording returned to me 20 minutes later. The first eruption may have relieved the summit without relieving the reservoir. I wrote that down. Then another scientist gave me an even simpler version. The mountain may have opened a lid. That is not formal terminology. But it is useful. At 2:38, County Emergency Management was informed that the morning event could no longer be treated as an isolated venting episode. At 2:51, an earlier reassurance disappeared from the public information page. The phrase, "no evidence supporting a larger near-term event" was removed. It was not replaced with a prediction. The absence mattered. At 3:06, the exclusion area expanded. At 3:18, selected communities along downstream corridors were told to prepare for possible evacuation. At 3:27, emergency crews were positioned near several bridges. At 3:41, the shelter that had considered reducing staff reversed that plan. At 3:53, a second shelter reopened a section it had already closed. Imagine being one of the people there. You leave home before sunrise. You sit in a school gym or community center for several hours. The television says the eruption was small, the mountain looks calm. You drive back, you unlock your house, you put groceries away, then the emergency message returns. Prepare to leave again. That is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There is no wall of fire outside, no ash cloud swallowing the road. Just a phone vibrating on a kitchen counter, a second evacuation warning, and the realization that the first all clear you thought you heard was never really an all clear at all. At 4:05, a caller from a road east of Tootle reported that neighbors were debating whether to leave. One had already evacuated once. Another said he would not leave a second time unless he could see something from his porch. That attitude appeared repeatedly in dispatch logs. We already left once. Nothing happened. The mountain is quiet. Emergency officials responded with a new sentence. Do not wait for visual confirmation. That sentence would become more important as the night continued. At 4:28 p.m., an earthquake researcher not directly involved with the volcano response raised an analogy that quickly circulated through geological teams. The analogy came from earthquake science, foreshocks and main shocks. The word foreshock is deceptive because you can usually identify one only after something larger happens. Before the main shock, it is simply an earthquake. In some fault systems, a smaller event can redistribute stress and help trigger a larger failure nearby. The smaller event does not merely warn of the larger one. It changes the physical conditions. The proposed Mount St. Helens analogy was limited. Volcanoes are not faults. Magma chambers do not behave exactly like earthquake zones, but the comparison was useful conceptually. What if the 4/11 eruption did more than precede the deeper unrest? What if it helped create the conditions for it? And if so, what does that make the first eruption? A finished event, or the first stage of a larger pressure transfer? The scientists discussing this comparison emphasized that no validated model could turn the idea into a countdown. No one could say 30 hours. 12 hours, 3 hours, no one could say there would definitely be another eruption, but the analogy changed the language being used privately. Instead of post-eruption recovery, scientists began talking about cascading instability. Again, that does not mean cascading eruptions. We have had one eruption, only one. Everything since has been unrest. The distinction is important. At 4:51, the deep earthquake count passed 60. At 5:14, the center of the activity was estimated several kilometers shallower than it had been at dawn. At 5:30, the first airborne gas team reported increasing carbon dioxide relative to earlier measurements. At 5:44, thermal output near the crater floor rose. At 6:02, another section of the dome showed fresh cracking. No eruption, no significant ash column, no large explosion. At 6:17, a narrow steam plume formed and dissipated. That was venting, not classified as a new eruptive event. At 6:31, the seismic tremor weakened. For 30 minutes, people in the monitoring center allowed themselves to consider that the system might finally be settling. Then something stranger happened. The earthquakes began disappearing. Between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m., 31 identifiable volcanic earthquakes were recorded. Between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m., 18. Between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m., 7. At first, that looked encouraging. The event count was falling, but the continuous background tremor was not. That distinction worried the scientists. If magma is forcing its way through intact rock, the rock breaks. You get discrete earthquakes. If a pathway becomes increasingly open, the material may move with fewer separate fractures. That can produce fewer identifiable earthquakes, while sustained tremor continues. One researcher compared it to a door. If you push against a locked door, the frame cracks. If the door opens, you stop hearing the cracking. The absence of cracking does not mean you stopped moving through it. Again, analogy, not literal volcanic plumbing, but the concept is important. At 7:42, a harmonic component appeared in the tremor. At 7:56, it strengthened. At 8:09, one deep station recorded a continuous signal lasting 6 minutes. At 8:18, another station recorded the same signal. At 8:31, individual episodes became difficult to separate. At 8:45, the monitoring report changed categories. Earlier, scientists had counted earthquakes. Now they were measuring the amplitude of continuous tremor. That was the first time today the mountain became harder to count. And that was when the old explanation stopped working. By 9 p.m., selected evacuation advisories had become orders. Not everywhere, not across entire counties. The orders focused on areas with the greatest exposure to lahars, debris flows, and rapid changes in volcanic activity. Traffic westbound increased. Some families left for the second time that day. One dispatch record described an argument at a checkpoint between an officer and a driver who wanted to return home for medication. Another family left a shelter at 3 p.m. and returned to the same shelter before 9. A listener near Silver Lake reported that her children had already unpacked their overnight bags once. She was packing them again. A man farther east told emergency dispatch he would leave only if sirens sounded. Officials told him the sirens might not provide enough warning, depending on the hazard. He left. Another caller did not. The problem with a false ending is not simply that people make one wrong decision. It damages trust in the next warning. At 9:18, the Geological Service issued a new update. Sustained volcanic tremor continued. Deformation remained elevated. Gas emissions remained above morning levels. Another eruption was possible with limited warning. Possible. Not expected. Not imminent. Possible. At 9:34, the wind weakened. That changed ash planning. If another significant eruption occurred, weaker upper-level winds could allow heavier material to fall closer to the mountain. At 9:51, road crews were moved away from 2 drainage corridors. At 10:03, bridge traffic controls were prepared. At 10:17, hospital administrators in several communities reviewed generator fuel. At 10:31, emergency dispatch centers began receiving more calls from people asking the same question. When can we go home? There was no useful answer. Night changes volcanic monitoring. During daylight, people trust their eyes. At night, the instruments become the landscape. Seismic traces, thermal images, gas numbers, GPS positions, tilt curves. The mountain itself disappeared behind cloud shortly after 10 p.m. At 10:14, the main visible light camera showed only darkness and drifting condensation. At 10:27, the thermal camera showed a warmer region spreading across part of the crater floor. At 10:43, another thermal instrument confirmed it. At 11:02, one remote microphone recorded a low-frequency pressure signal. Most people would not hear it as a sound. The frequency was too low, but sensitive instruments detected it. At 11:16, residents near Cougar reported occasional window vibration. No earthquake was large enough to explain every report. At 11:29, a transportation sensor recorded vibration during one of the same periods. At 11:44, a monitoring station reported a small change in ground tilt. At midnight, the deformation rate increased again. Not dramatically, but enough that the trend line no longer looked flat. At 12:18, a summit camera briefly saturated white in the thermal range. It recovered. Technicians suspected condensation or a calibration glitch. At 12:24, another thermal unit recorded the same temperature increase. The first camera had not necessarily failed. It may simply have been looking at something hotter than expected. At 12:37, a north-facing monitoring camera stopped transmitting. Power status remained available. The camera electronics appeared to be alive. The data link was not. At 12:46, technicians attempted a remote reset. No response. At 12:58, the camera disappeared from the network completely. That was the first monitoring loss of the night. One missing camera does not imply destruction. Ash can interrupt radio links, antennas can ice, electronics fail, but the location of that camera made the timing uncomfortable. It sat on a ridge that had been stable all day. At 1:11, a second remote radio link began dropping packets. At 1:26, it recovered. At 1:31, it dropped again. The volcano still had not erupted. From the public side, nothing had happened for almost a full day. From the monitoring side, the number of things happening without an eruption was growing. It is worth reminding you that this is my first night in this chair. There are moments when that becomes more obvious to me than I would like. At 1:40 this morning, I reached for a binder Daniel normally keeps to the left of the console. It was not there. I spent 30 seconds looking for it. Our engineer pointed to a shelf directly behind me. Apparently, everyone else knows that is where emergency frequency documentation lives. I did not. There is something comforting about ordinary incompetence during a strange night. A missing binder, a clock that runs slow, coffee that has been reheated twice, a headset cable that catches on the desk. These things behave normally. I called my father again around 1:50. He answered. He had moved farther south. He told me he was staying with an old friend outside the most immediate hazard area. I asked why he had left when his road was not yet under evacuation. He said because officials seemed more worried than the mountain looked. That was his entire explanation. Officials seemed more worried than the mountain looked. I wrote that down too. He asked if I still had his photograph on the desk. I said yes. He told me to keep it there. Then the line cut out. Not dramatically. Cell service. He called back 10 seconds later. We spoke another minute. I mentioned that because not every broken connection tonight means something ominous. Phone calls drop, equipment glitches, weather interferes with radio, people lose power. If we begin treating every ordinary failure as part of the volcano, we stop doing useful work. The difficulty is recognizing the moment an ordinary failure becomes a pattern. At 2:04, our station building vibrated. Very lightly, 9 seconds. The engineer checked ventilation. No issue. Generator off. No heavy vehicle outside. At 2:11, it happened again. At approximately the same time, regional seismic stations recorded a small event beneath the Mount St. Helens system. Could we have felt it? Possibly. Building resonance can amplify certain frequencies. Could it have been something else? Also possible. We logged it. At 2:18, another vibration. This time I felt it through the desk. Not enough to move anything. Enough that the coffee surface trembled. I looked at the photograph. For a moment I turned it face down. I cannot give you a scientific reason for that. I simply needed the desk to contain things I could act on. Road closures, wind direction, emergency contacts, monitoring reports, information belonging to now. At 2:32 a.m., Dr. Venn participated in another technical briefing. The important part was not what she knew, it was which explanations had been removed. Equipment error, no longer plausible as the main cause. Hydrothermal movement alone, no longer sufficient. Normal post-eruption adjustment, increasingly inconsistent with deformation. New magma moving upward. Now the leading interpretation. She was asked whether scientists could estimate how much material was involved. No reliable volume yet. She was asked whether the deeper reservoir had been underestimated. Possible. She was asked whether the first eruption had triggered the current instability. Possible. She was asked whether a second eruption was now likely. The answer was that likelihood had increased, but the timing remained unconstrained. Then a reporter asked the question everyone wanted answered. How large? No answer. There was simply no validated way to convert the current signal into an eruption size. A small event remained possible. A moderate event remained possible. A larger event remained possible. No eruption at all remained possible. That is an uncomfortable range. But uncertainty does not disappear because people dislike it. At 2:46, another scientist explained why prediction had become so difficult. Every time the monitoring team updated the model, the volcano changed one of the assumptions. After an eruption, pressure should decrease. Deep pressure increased. As pressure increased, earthquake rates should remain elevated. Discrete earthquakes decreased, while tremor became continuous. If the system were sealing, gas output might fall. Gas output rose. If the magma were stalling, deformation might stabilize. It did not. The system was behaving logically in pieces, but the pieces were not producing the expected whole. At 3:02, one scientist used the phrase non-equilibrium system. At 3:17, another used evolving conduit network. At 3:31, a third said the safest description was simply unstable. That word finally entered the public bulletin at 3:44. The volcanic system remains elevated and unstable. For most of yesterday, officials avoided that word. Now they were using it. We want to remind listeners that you are tuned to Fictional radio broadcast, continuing to monitor this developing situation. It is shortly after 4 a.m. We are approaching 24 hours since the first eruption. Mount St. Helens has not erupted again. That sentence is true. It is also less reassuring than it sounds. At 4:11 a.m., exactly 24 hours after yesterday's eruption, the monitoring network recorded another tremor pulse. There is no evidence the timing means anything. Volcanoes do not operate on clocks. Human beings do. We notice anniversaries, 24 hours, 1 day. The important measurement was amplitude. The tremor pulse was stronger than the average level recorded during the previous 6 hours. At 4:21, another followed. At 4:36, a third. Then at 4:38, exactly 24 hours after the original deep earthquake, another deep signal appeared. Again, the timing is almost certainly coincidence. I am emphasizing that because pattern seeking becomes dangerous during emergencies. The new event originated shallower than the original 4:38 earthquake. That part was not coincidence. The center of activity had migrated upward. At 4:52, gas output rose sharply. At 5:03, the crater thermal anomaly widened. At 5:18, one monitoring station measured rapid local tilt. At 5:29, the rate slowed. At 5:42, it accelerated again. At 6:01, emergency officials announced that evacuation orders would remain in effect. At 6:14, several residents attempted to return through checkpoints. They were turned around. At 6:31, the cloud deck briefly lifted. For the first time in hours, cameras showed Mount St. Helens clearly, and this created a new public problem. It looked calm, a thin steam plume, some dark ash around the crater, snow on surrounding slopes, no huge column, no obvious eruption, no visible lava, no collapse. If you saw only the picture, you would probably ask why thousands of people were being kept away. Then the high-resolution thermal image came in. Several fractures around the dome were warmer than the surrounding rock. One crack had widened overnight. Another had appeared where none was visible the day before. Gas was escaping from at least 2 new points. The mountain looked quieter because pressure had found more places to leak. Scientists did not know whether that was good or bad. A leaking system can relieve pressure. A widening pathway can also allow more material to rise. The same observation supported 2 opposite outcomes. That is what made the morning so difficult. Between 6:45 and 7:45 a.m., seismic tremor decreased, gas output leveled, deformation slowed, thermal readings remained elevated but stable. For 1 hour, the volcano did almost exactly what everyone wanted it to do. Emergency officials did not change the evacuation order. Scientists did not issue an all clear, but inside the monitoring center, several researchers began discussing whether the deeper pressure pulse had peaked. At 7:09, one model showed the inflation rate approaching zero. At 7:16, a second model agreed. At 7:28, the trend held. At 7:42, the trend still held. For 60 minutes, Mount St. Helens appeared to stabilize. Then at 7:51, the southern GPS station moved 1.4 centimeters. At 7:54, another station moved. At 7:57, a third. At 8:02, the deformation model recalculated automatically. The pressure center had shifted upward. Not expanded dramatically, shifted. That difference matters. The deeper inflation was slowing because the pressure was no longer concentrated at the same depth. It had moved. At 8:11, shallow tremor increased. At 8:17, the crater floor tiltmeter recorded its fastest sustained change of the entire event. At 8:23, the calm hour was officially over. The new interpretation was worse than simple continued inflation. Material appeared to be migrating into the upper volcanic system. At 8:30, emergency managers were told that the probability of another eruptive event had increased substantially. Still no countdown, still no certainty, but for the first time, planning shifted from if another eruption occurs to when rapid escalation begins. Those are not the same sentence. At 9 a.m., we crossed 29 hours since the first eruption. The second eruption still had not happened. This extended quiet became psychologically dangerous. Evacuation fatigue was setting in. Businesses farther from the mountain wanted to reopen. People were missing work. Schools were making decisions. Families were paying for hotel rooms. Emergency shelters were crowded. Pets were difficult to manage. Medications were running low. The volcano had become an inconvenience to people who could not see it doing anything. At 9:14, officials received reports of vehicles stopping along roads outside the exclusion area so people could photograph the mountain. At 9:26, one driver attempted to use a forest road to bypass a checkpoint. The road was blocked farther ahead. He turned around. At 9:41, emergency management issued another reminder. No all clear has been issued. At 10:03, the Geological Service released its strongest warning yet. Monitoring networks continue to detect elevated volcanic tremor, rapid shallow deformation, increased gas discharge, and thermal changes within the crater. A significant eruptive event could occur with little or no additional warning. Residents within evacuation zones were instructed to remain outside them. That phrase, little or no additional warning, is important. People imagine volcano warnings as escalating spectacle, more smoke, more earthquakes, more noise. Sometimes that happens, but if a pathway has already opened, the final transition can be fast. At 10:19, a scheduled helicopter observation mission was cancelled. The mountain was visible, weather was acceptable. The flight was cancelled because the monitoring team no longer wanted personnel near the crater. That decision communicated more than the public bulletin. At 10:37, 2 remaining high-elevation field crews were ordered out. At 10:49, the first crew reported clear. At 10:56, the second began descending. At 11:08, both were confirmed outside the inner zone. The volcano now had almost no human observers nearby. From this point forward, machines would watch the mountain. At 11:12, one crater station recorded rapid uplift. At 11:17, another confirmed it. At 11:24, gas output increased. At 11:31, harmonic tremor strengthened. At 11:43, the acoustic network detected a low continuous signal. At noon, the sky remained mostly clear. The mountain still looked calm. At 12:14 p.m., emergency broadcasters were given a specific instruction. Stop replaying yesterday morning's early update without context. The reason was simple. Clips were circulating online. One contained the sentence that the initial explosive phase appeared to have concluded. People were sharing it as evidence that authorities were contradicting themselves. The statement had been accurate when issued. The mistake was treating old information as current guidance. So I want to make this completely clear. If you have a saved clip from yesterday morning saying the explosive event had ended, do not use it to decide what to do today. If you have a screenshot saying additional major activity was not anticipated at that time, do not treat that as a current forecast. Evidence changed. The official position changed with it. That is not inconsistency. That is how monitoring works. At 12:29, another old video began circulating, showing a quiet crater under clear sky. It had been recorded hours earlier. People were reposting it as live. Emergency officials asked broadcasters to include timestamps whenever possible. At 12:46, a small debris flow triggered a sensor high in one drainage. Not a major lahar. Water, loose ash, snowmelt, and volcanic sediment can move without a new eruption. At 12:58, another sensor triggered. At 1:11, a third. That told officials the channels were already carrying unstable material. If a major eruption suddenly melted snow or displaced crater material, the river systems would respond quickly. At 1:23, bridge crews were pulled farther back. At 1:41, roadblocks were moved. At 1:52, emergency responders were told not to enter two high-risk corridors under any circumstances without authorization. That instruction meant something difficult. If someone ignored the evacuation order and became trapped, rescuers might not be sent after them. Not because emergency crews did not want to help, because sending more people into the hazard could create additional victims. At 2:04, the wind began shifting. At 2:17, ash dispersion forecasts were recalculated. At 2:31, aviation restrictions expanded. At 2:44, the crater emitted a darker plume. It rose only a short distance, no significant explosion, no second eruption. The plume thinned after several minutes. At 2:57, another short ash emission occurred, again, not classified as a separate eruption. The volcano was breathing ash without crossing whatever threshold remained between unrest and explosive failure. That threshold was becoming the only thing everyone cared about. At 3:05 p.m., scientists produced the final integrated model before the second eruption. I say final, not because anyone knew it would be final. It simply became the last complete model before events moved faster than analysis. The results showed three things. First, the deeper pressure source that had expanded after yesterday morning's eruption had slowed. Second, shallow deformation had accelerated. Third, seismic energy was increasingly concentrated along a zone connecting the two. There were multiple possible interpretations. One involved magma rising into a shallow storage region. Another involved a network of fractures transmitting pressure without a large volume of magma physically moving all the way upward. Another involved gas-rich melt interacting with older material already beneath the crater. No model could confidently distinguish them. The experts agreed on only one practical conclusion. The upper system was becoming less stable. At 3:17, Dr. Venn was asked whether the mountain was closer to erupting than it had been an hour earlier. Her answer was yes. She was asked whether that meant minutes. No. Hours. Possibly. Another day. Possible. No eruption. Still possible. Then the reporter asked what would convince her that an eruption had actually begun. She listed several possibilities. A sudden increase in high-frequency seismic energy, a rapid pressure pulse, loss of multiple crater instruments, a fast rise in ash emission, a surface collapse, or simply visual confirmation. At 3:26, Cedar 9, one of the most reliable seismic stations in the network, stopped transmitting. Technicians checked the network. Other stations remained online. At 3:30, Cedar 9 returned for 12 seconds. The waveform was saturated. Then it disappeared again. At 3:33, North Thermal 2 began dropping frames. At 3:35, it recovered. At 3:38, it saturated. At 3:40, the image returned. The crater floor was brighter. At 3:42, the station went offline. 2 instruments. At 3:45, an upper acoustic sensor stopped responding. 3. One of the criteria Dr. Venn had mentioned less than 30 minutes earlier was loss of multiple crater instruments. At 3:47, the monitoring center moved to eruption response posture. No eruption had been confirmed yet, but no one there was waiting for certainty anymore. It is 3:51 p.m. There is vibration in this building again, stronger than last night. Our engineer has checked mechanical systems. Nothing here explains it. The coffee surface beside me is moving, not violently, small concentric ripples. The same thing listeners reported from homes much closer to the mountain yesterday. We are far enough away that this does not represent direct volcanic danger by itself. Ground waves travel, buildings resonate, but it is noticeable. At 3:53, one incoming phone line disconnected. At 3:54, another did. The system recovered. At 3:55, our primary data feed from the Geological service froze for 11 seconds. It resumed. The timestamp jumped forward. At 3:56, the monitoring center reported a rapid increase in acoustic energy. At 3:57, the tremor amplitude rose sharply. At 3:58, multiple seismic traces went off scale. At 3:59, the crater camera showed a dark jet rising above the dome. At 4 o'clock, the jet widened. We still do not have official confirmation of a second explosive eruption. At 4:01, there is a pressure signal on our engineering monitor. At 4:02, the windows in this studio moved. Not shattered, moved. The sound arrived afterward, low, distant, long enough that everyone in the control room stopped talking. At 4:03, the Geological Service issued a priority alert. Rapid changes at Mount St. Helens indicate an eruptive transition may be underway. All persons must remain outside designated hazard zones. At 4:04, the ash emission increased. At 4:05, the visible plume began climbing rapidly. At 4:06, lightning appeared within it. At 4:07, one remaining crater camera vanished behind ash. At 4:08, thermal imagery showed a rapidly expanding hot area. At 4:09, another seismic station failed. At 4:10, the pressure signal increased again. I have turned the photograph on my desk, face up. Mount St. Helens, before 1980. Blue sky, white summit. My father's handwriting on the back. July, no year. At 4:11 p.m., exactly 36 hours after yesterday morning's eruption time, Mount St. Helens is in rapid escalation. There is still a distinction between an ash emission and a confirmed large explosive event. That distinction is becoming very difficult to maintain. It is 4:12 p.m. The plume is expanding. 4:13. Monitoring center confirms explosive activity. This is the second eruption. I am going to say that again because this is the point we have been discussing for 36 hours. A second eruption is now underway at Mount St. Helens. The event began approximately 1 minute after the 36-hour mark from the first eruption time. There is no scientific significance attached to that timing, but the second event is now confirmed. At 4:14, the ash column is climbing rapidly. No reliable height yet. At 4:15, multiple cameras north and east of the crater are offline. At 4:16, lightning is visible inside the column. At 4:17, Observers from outside the exclusion zone report a broad dark cloud forming beneath the vertical plume. At 4:18, the monitoring center reports possible pyroclastic density currents inside the crater and on the upper flanks. That report is preliminary. At 4:19, Lahar sensors have triggered in the upper North Fork Tootle drainage. At 4:20, another sensor activates. At 4:21, emergency management orders all personnel away from designated river corridors. At 4:22, the ash column is estimated above 25,000 feet and still climbing. At 4:23, aviation authorities are diverting aircraft across a much wider area. At 4:24, the eruption intensity has exceeded the first event by a substantial margin. That much is already clear. At 4:25, our station windows vibrated again. At 4:26, fine ash is being reported significantly farther west. Wind conditions are carrying portions of the plume toward populated areas. If ash begins falling where you are, close doors and windows. Reduce outside air intake if your system allows it safely. Protect your eyes. Protect your breathing. Avoid unnecessary driving. Volcanic ash is not soft fireplace ash. It is abrasive. It can damage engines. It can reduce visibility quickly. At 4:28, the first confirmed Lahar is moving into an upper drainage. We do not have reliable size estimates. Do not approach rivers to observe it. Do not go to bridges to watch. At 4:29, another flow sensor activates. At 4:30, authorities report rapid water and debris movement in more than one channel. At 4:31, the eruption column has passed 30,000 feet. At 4:32, one thermal satellite product shows a large hot zone where yesterday's shallow deformation was concentrated. At 4:33, there is a report of partial crater collapse. Preliminary, at 4:34, a monitoring team confirms ground-hugging hot material moving away from the collapse area. Pyroclastic flow activity is now considered likely. At 4:35, anyone remaining inside the primary exclusion zone is in immediate danger. I need to phrase that carefully. We do not know how many people, if any, remain inside. Do not spread casualty claims. Do not repeat unverified numbers. At 4:36, the ash cloud is reducing daylight east of the mountain. At 4:37, highway patrol units are moving traffic farther away from several river crossings. At 4:38, exactly 36 hours after the deep earthquake that first altered the scientific picture yesterday morning, tremor across the surviving network is near saturation. Again, the matching time is coincidence, but I understand why people will remember it. At 4:39, our exterior camera shows ash in the air here. Light, not yet heavy. At 4:40, our engineer is closing one outside ventilation intake. At 4:41, backup power systems are ready. At 4:42, we have lost one regional relay. Listeners in some areas may notice weaker reception. If you lose this signal, follow local emergency instructions. Do not stay in danger to keep listening. Your radio is a tool. It is not a reason to remain. At 4:43, another Lahar monitoring point has activated. At 4:44, the Geological Service says the second eruption remains intense. At 4:45, the ash column height is being revised upward. At 4:46, emergency shelters are being expanded. At 4:47, transportation officials are asking drivers not involved in evacuation to stay off designated routes. At 4:48, visibility is falling west of the mountain. At 4:49, the sound here is continuous now. Low, not loud, more felt through the desk than heard. At 4:50, the first eruption has become almost impossible to compare with this one. Yesterday's event lasted minutes. This event is still intensifying, and now we understand why the first eruption size was never the important measurement. The important measurement was what happened beneath the mountain afterward. It is 4:57 p.m. I want to revisit the central question while we still have stable communication. Did the first eruption cause the second? The answer tonight is that we do not know with scientific certainty, but the evidence supports a sequence. At 4:11 yesterday morning, the shallow system released. At 4:38, deep seismic activity began. Deep deformation increased. Gas signatures suggested deeper material. The center of seismic activity moved upward. The deeper inflation eventually slowed as shallow deformation increased. The earthquake count decreased while continuous tremor strengthened. Crater fractures warmed. Monitoring instruments began failing. Then the second eruption began. That is the sequence. The leading working hypothesis is that the first eruption changed the pressure conditions above a deeper gas-rich magmatic system. That pressure change may have allowed magma and gas to expand. That expansion may have helped open or widen pathways upward. The first eruption may not have emptied the volcanic system. It may have made upward movement easier. That is the geological parallel to the foreshock idea we discussed yesterday. Not because eruptions and earthquakes are the same. They are not. But because a smaller failure can sometimes redistribute stress in a way that contributes to a larger failure later. We will need months of data to know how accurate that explanation is, maybe years. Scientists will examine rock chemistry, gas ratios, seismic waveforms, crystal structures, pressure histories, satellite deformation. They will reconstruct these 36 hours 1 minute at a time. Tonight, none of that helps someone sitting in an evacuation shelter wondering whether their house is still there. Science can explain mechanism later. Emergency broadcasting has to deal with now. And now the second eruption is continuing. At 5:06, we have reports of power interruptions in scattered communities. At 5:09, a hospital outside the primary hazard zone transferred to partial generator support after ash affected external equipment. At 5:12, a school being used as an evacuation shelter requested additional masks. At 5:15, several roads are experiencing severe congestion. At 5:18, emergency officials are urging people already outside danger areas not to drive. At 5:21, ash accumulation is being reported on vehicles. At 5:24, some cellular networks are congested. Text messages may get through when calls do not. At 5:27, one family that left the valley yesterday morning, returned yesterday afternoon, and evacuated again last night, has now been moved to a second shelter because of ashfall. Think about that, not as a statistic, a family. 3 relocations in 36 hours, children sleeping in unfamiliar rooms, adults checking phones, pets in carriers, medication in plastic bags, a house somewhere under a sky they cannot see. This is how disaster usually feels to the people inside it, not as one enormous moment, as a sequence of small, exhausting decisions. What do we take? Which road? Do we leave now? Can we go back? Is the warning still active? Is the old video current? Did the bridge close? Do we have enough fuel? Where is the dog? Did anyone call Grandma? At 5:31, emergency management asks us to repeat that there is no all clear. At 5:34, the second eruption remains active. At 5:36, seismic tremor is still high. At 5:38, the ash column continues. At 5:40, we are approaching the point where this section of the broadcast will transfer to continuous emergency updates. Before that happens, I want to speak to you directly. If you normally hear Daniel Hale here, you will hear him again. He is away for several days. Nothing more dramatic than that. For now, you have me, Ethan Cole. I had imagined introducing myself differently, maybe during overnight weather, maybe before a traffic report, maybe with enough time to explain where I came from and why I sound slightly different from the person you are used to hearing. Instead, my first extended shift began with a volcano. I have spent most of the last day watching official language change one phrase at a time. Minor venting. Initial explosive phase concluded. Ongoing unrest. Elevated deformation. Possible further activity. Limited warning. Unstable system. Immediate evacuation. Second eruption underway. There is something important in that sequence. It is not that scientists failed. Science is not the ability to predict every event before it happens. Science is the discipline of changing the explanation when evidence changes. Yesterday morning, the available evidence made the eruption look small. Then the deeper instruments told a different story. The responsible response was not to defend the old reassurance. It was to change the warning. That is what happened. I called my father again about 20 minutes ago. The call did not connect. Before anyone reads significance into that, cellular networks are congested. His last confirmed location was safe. I expect that is where he remains. The photograph he gave me is still on the desk. The old mountain, before 1980. That shape no longer exists. When I was younger, I thought that was the point of the photograph. A mountain changed. Tonight I think I understand what he meant differently. The photograph does not only show what the mountain used to look like, it shows what people expected tomorrow to look like. They saw the mountain one day. They assumed the next day's mountain would be approximately the same. Most days, that assumption works. Civilization depends on it. Roads will remain where they were yesterday. Rivers will follow the same valleys. Buildings will stay upright. The sky will look familiar. Mountains will keep their shape. Disasters are moments when that ordinary agreement between today and tomorrow breaks. At 4:11 yesterday morning, people saw Mount St. Helens erupt. For a few hours, many believed that was the disaster. At 4:38, instruments beneath the mountain began telling a different story. For the next 35 hours, the visible mountain became quieter while the hidden system became harder to explain. Then today, just after the 36-hour mark, the second eruption began. The lesson is not that every quiet volcano is about to erupt. The lesson is not to fear every earthquake. The lesson is simpler. When conditions change, use current information. Do not use yesterday's reassurance against today's evidence. If you are under an evacuation order, remain out. If you are downstream of the mountain, stay away from river corridors until officials say otherwise. If ash is falling, reduce unnecessary travel. Protect your breathing. Keep doors and windows closed where practical. Keep radios and phones charged when power is available. Use text messaging if voice networks are overloaded. Do not drive toward the mountain. Do not approach bridges to watch lahars. Do not enter restricted roads for photographs. Do not return because the sound stops. Do not return because the plume becomes smaller. Do not return because the sky gets brighter. The first time this mountain became quiet, people thought the event had ended. We will not make that assumption twice. The second eruption is continuing. There is no all clear. There is no reliable estimate yet for when this eruptive phase will end. And there is no final scientific explanation for why the system destabilized the way it did. That explanation will come later. Maybe. For tonight, what matters is distance, information, patience, and remembering that quiet is an observation. It is not a guarantee. This is Ethan Cole, concluding this portion of continuous coverage for Fictional radio broadcast. Live reports from fictional events. Daniel will be back behind the microphone after his scheduled time away. Until then, I will remain with the emergency desk as needed. The ash outside this station is getting heavier. The mountain is no longer visible from here. The surviving instruments are still transmitting. And 36 hours after everyone thought the first eruption was over, Mount St. Helens is erupting again. Keep the roads clear, keep your radio close, and if the mountain becomes quiet tonight, wait for the people watching the instruments to tell you what that quiet means.